So the third principle of this teaching is that freedom from the egoic consciousness comes about by awakening to your true nature as conscious spirit. So the whole notion of freedom and truth actually depends on your awakening from this egoic state of consciousness to your true, real nature as conscious spirit. So people often think that this is difficult, that it would take a very long time, they must struggle very hard to break free from this egoic state of consciousness. But if you pause for a moment and you remember what the ego is, that actually there isn't really an ego as an entity, as a thing. Again, ego is just a circular pattern of thinking based in the belief in separation. So ego is nothing more than a pattern of thinking, self-referential thinking. And since ego is nothing more than a pattern of thinking, which may be very strong, it may be something that you've been identified with for a very, very long time. But since that ego structure, in the way that I'm defining it, is nothing more than a pattern of thinking, then it means that the possibility of breaking free of that pattern of thinking is certainly not an impossibility, and actually may be much easier and much more immediate and much more available than you ever imagined. So in this third principle of the teaching, which says that freedom from egoic consciousness is based upon awakening from the ego to your true nature as conscious spirit. So let's look at what conscious spirit might be. We've talked about what ego is. Ego is just addiction to and attachment to thought and thinking. Now you can't get rid of thoughts and you can't get rid of thinking. To battle your mind is one of the most deceptive ways that the mind keeps you in its own domain. Spiritual practitioners for thousands of years have actually battled their mind. They've tried to make their mind stop. They've tried to stop thinking about certain things. They've tried to make their mind only pay attention to what they want it to pay attention to. But all these efforts really ultimately end in some amount of failure. And that's because they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is because attachment to and identification with mind causes suffering, they think that mind must be eliminated, that you must stop thinking. But that's to miss the basic cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is not thinking, it's identification with thinking. This is very, very important to understand. Because if you don't understand that it's identification with thinking that's really at the heart of the matter, and you assume that it's thinking itself that's the problem, then you can waste immense amounts of time and energy trying to stop your mind from thinking, trying to better your mind. But as soon as you understand that the only dilemma here is identification with thinking, and it's the identification that's all we really need to look at. And so thinking and the identification with it creates a sense of separation and a sense of ego. Now, when we begin to question all that, when we begin to look at all this in such a way that we see the unreality of what the mind is doing, when you begin to see that you are not your mind. The mind is something that happens within you. Thinking is something that happens within what you are. Thinking does not define what you are. Thinking doesn't define anything. Thinking happens within what you are. And that's a very profound thing to begin to realize. Because when you start to realize that thinking happens within what you are, identification happens within what and who you are, then you stop battling thinking. You realize that you, what you really and truly are, you must be something other than thinking, other than the mind. You must be something than this ego, this image of yourself that the mind has created. Because the mind is something that happens within you. Thinking happens within you. So what is this real you? What is it that thinking, that the mind happens within and that it occurs to? And as a way of using an idea to talk about this, I talk about your true nature as being conscious spirit. Now, first the word spirit. The word spirit is used because our true nature is something that is ineffable. In other words, it's not something you can grasp. It's not something it's not something you can really think about. It's not something you can touch, taste, or feel. Our true nature is actually very ineffable. It's because it has no shape, because it has no form. That is the reason that I call it spirit. Spirit is that which exists, but it doesn't have a particular shape or a particular form. Now, conscious spirit is the most important thing. We are all conscious, and in some way. The question is, what are we conscious of? As I said earlier, most people, their consciousness is completely identified with and literally in a trance state with the mind, and that creates ego. But when you start to see that that mind doesn't define you, then naturally your awareness or your consciousness comes back to itself. And that ineffable being that you are begins to become conscious. You are spirit all the time. You are this ineffable being, this presence all the time. You are it at any and every second of your life. There's never been a moment where you haven't been what you really and truly are. How could you ever be what you aren't? You can only ever truly be what you really are. Nor can you stop being what you truly are. But you can become unconscious of it. And as soon as you become unconscious of it, then you tend to identify with ego. So when we spiritually awaken, when we come to the realization that we are not this identity that the mind has created, but we're actually spirit, at that moment spirit has become conscious of itself. It's become conscious of itself as spirit, as ineffable being, as a sort of conscious presence. Now, most people have not been taught that they are a conscious presence, that they are conscious spirit. Most people, most all of us, we get told that we are a particular person with a particular history and background, with particular talents, and we have a gender and all the ways that we're taught to describe ourselves. But most people never grew up with the notion that actually you are conscious spirit. Essentially, you and I and all beings everywhere are really conscious spirit. We're this ineffable, conscious presence of being. And yet that realization forms the whole foundation of what spirituality is really meant to show you. It's meant to show you, to awaken you to your true nature, to the truth of your being, so that the spirit that you are becomes conscious. When it becomes conscious, that's what spiritual awakening means, when what your true nature becomes conscious.